"Step out of the vehicle," the officer said, and Imani Whitfield kept both hands high on the steering wheel and did not move an inch. She was 8 months pregnant. She was sitting in her own car, in the driveway of a house that had her own name printed on the deed, and the man leaning into her open window had one hand resting on his holster, and a look on his face that said he had already decided exactly who she was and exactly what she was doing there. 2 minutes ago, this had been an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind you forget by lunch. It was not ordinary anymore, and some quiet part of her understood that it might not be over for a long, long time. "Whose car is this?" he asked. There was no curiosity in the question. There was only accusation, the kind dressed up to sound like procedure. "It is mine," Imani answered, and her voice did not shake. She had spent 10 years learning how to keep it from shaking, and she was not going to lose that skill now. On her own driveway, in front of her own front door. "I closed on this house 5 weeks ago," she went on, even and unhurried. "The paperwork is in the bag on the seat beside me. I am only here to walk through the rooms one more time before the movers come on Thursday. If you would like, I can show you the deed." He smiled at that. It was not a kind smile. It was the small, certain smile of a man who has already decided you are lying to him and is simply waiting for you to prove it. And Imani, who knew that exact smile better than almost anyone alive, felt something cold settle low in her chest. It was not fear, it was recognition. She had sat across a table from men wearing precisely that expression more times than she could count. And she knew, the way other people know the smell of rain coming, where a morning that started with that smile usually ended. For a moment, neither of them said another word. A dry magnolia leaf scraped across the driveway and caught against his cruiser tire. A sprinkler clicked on somewhere down the block and began to hiss over a perfect green lawn. She watched his thumb move, slow and unconscious, toward the grip of his weapon, and she made a decision she had made many times in her career, though never once for herself. She decided to stop trying to be believed. She decided to be exact instead. Most people, looking at Imani Whitfield, saw only what they expected to see. A tired, pregnant woman in a linen dress, hair pulled back against the Carolina heat, an easy thing to push around on a slow morning. What they did not see, because she had learned a long time ago not to show it, was the rest of her. She was a senior trial attorney in the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice, in the small, serious section that investigates police departments for a living. For 10 years, her job had been to sit across from officers who were certain they had done nothing wrong, to read their reports line by line, to study their body camera footage frame by frame, and to ask one patient question after another until the truth had nowhere left to hide. She knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what an unlawful stop looked like from the inside. She had simply never expected to be sitting in the middle of one with a contraction starting low in her back. So she did the only thing her training allowed. She kept her hands where he could see them. She kept her tone flat and level. And she let the man in front of her make every single decision himself, because she had learned long ago that the record matters more than the moment, and because some instinct told her that cameras she had not yet counted were already watching all of this. This was supposed to be one of the happiest weeks of her life. 5 weeks earlier, she and her husband Elijah had closed on this house, in a development called Saddlebrook Estates, built by a company named Hartwell Properties, on the north edge of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was the kind of place Imani had grown up watching from the window of a city bus. The kind of place that for most of her childhood had felt like a country she would never be handed a visa to enter. Now her name was on the deed, in ink, right next to her husband's. The man on her driveway had simply decided that could not possibly be real. His name was Garrett Doyle. and he had worked this beat for 16 years. In that time, he had built himself a private theory of the place, a theory he was very proud of. He believed he could tell, almost on sight, who belonged behind these gates and who was only passing through with bad intentions. He called it instinct. He called it reading the room. Over 13 years, 22 formal complaints had been filed against him, most of them saying the same thing in slightly different words, and every single one had been quietly closed and filed away and forgotten. Garrett Doyle had taken the wrong lesson from all that silence. He had decided it meant he had been right the whole time. If he had been honest with himself, he already knew her story checked out. He had watched her roll through the visitor lane at 9:52 that morning, and the license plate reader in his cruiser had pinged and then cleared. The vehicle was registered. It was insured. It was flagged for absolutely nothing. He had looked at that screen, and then he had looked at the driver, a black woman alone in a luxury car in Saddlebrook Estates, and he had decided the screen was wrong. The car, for whatever it was worth to a man who had already made up his mind, was 3 months old and paid for in full, with money Imani had earned the slow and difficult way, 1 long year at a time. None of that meant a thing to him. To Garrett Doyle, she was a guess, and he liked his guess. Inside her head, Imani had started to count the same way she always did at work, without even deciding to. First, a stop with no lawful basis at all, since the plate had already come back clean. Second, a question built to corner her rather than to clarify anything. Third, a hand resting on a weapon during an encounter that threatened no one. There is a piece of law that sits right at the center of what was going wrong on that driveway, and it is worth carrying out of this story. A stop like this one requires what the courts call reasonable, articulable suspicion. That means a specific, describable reason to believe a specific crime is happening or about to happen. A hunch does not clear that bar. A feeling about who fits a neighborhood does not clear it. And the color of a person's skin has never, not one single time in the history of the law, been a lawful reason to suspect anyone of anything. Doyle carried her license back to his cruiser anyway and ran it a second time, as if the machine might change its answer if he asked it twice. It did not. Valid. No warrants, no alerts, nothing at all. He sat there with the air conditioning humming, and he felt the one thing he truly could not stand, which was the feeling of being wrong. And a man like Garrett Doyle did not handle that feeling with any grace whatsoever. So he reached for the one tool that could turn his wounded pride back into authority. He keyed his radio and reported a possible stolen vehicle and an uncooperative subject. The dispatcher logged the call at 9:58 in the morning. There was no stolen vehicle. There was no uncooperative subject, not yet. But the words were recorded now, dispatched, real in the only way that mattered to the machinery of a morning like this one, and once he had said them out loud, he could not afford for them to stay untrue. So he set about making them true. Hold on to that, because everything that came after it was nothing more than one man trying to force a lie to catch up with him. He came back to her window wearing a different face. "Step out of the vehicle," he said again, harder this time. Imani asked him, calm as ever, what the legal basis was. He told her she was being detained in connection with a stolen vehicle investigation. She told him, just as calmly, that the vehicle was registered to her, that he had already run the plate himself, twice, and that she would step out and comply, but that she wanted the reason stated clearly, out loud, for the record. That word, record, landed on him like a slap across the face. He yanked the door open himself. What happened in the next 9 seconds would take 3 years to fully unwind. Doyle took her by the arm and pulled her up out of the seat faster than a woman 8 months pregnant should ever be moved. She did not pull away from him. She told him twice in a level voice that she might be going into early labor, that the tightening had started low in her back, that she needed to sit down. He told her to stop resisting. She was not resisting. Her hands were already moving behind her. Across the street, a retired librarian named Lorraine Bishop had stepped out onto her porch with her coffee. And when she saw a heavily pregnant woman being turned against a car by a man with a hand on his holster, she did the thing more and more ordinary people have learned to do. She lifted her phone and she started to record. Here is something true that the next part depends on. In this country, recording the police while they perform their duties in a public place is a protected activity. Lorraine Bishop did not need anyone's permission. She just needed steady hands and the nerve to keep filming, and she had both. She was not the only lens either. The doorbell camera mounted beside Imani's own brand new front door was already recording. So was the body camera on Doyle's chest and the dash camera in his cruiser. 4 lenses, 4 angles, one single stubborn truth. Doyle would spend the next many months insisting on his own private version of events, and he never once seemed to grasp the simplest fact of his situation, which was that his version no longer belonged to him. He pressed her forward over the warm hood of the car. He brought the cuffs around her wrists and ratcheted them tight. Imani felt the heat of the metal against her cheek and the hard edge of a contraction pulling low in her body. And she did the only thing her training and her dignity left her room to do. She went still. She breathed. She memorized his badge number, 3127, the time on her own dashboard clock, and the exact words coming out of his mouth. Then she said quietly, "Only this. I am not resisting and I need medical attention." He told her to save it. And then, for the length of one held breath, the whole scene seemed to freeze in place. The cuffs clicked shut. A bead of sweat slid down the side of her face and dropped onto the black paint. Far off, a lawnmower droned and then went silent, as if the whole neighborhood had stopped to listen. She did not cry out. She did not argue. She closed her eyes, found the rhythm of her own breathing, and let those 4 cameras do the only work that would matter in the end. A second officer pulled up then, a younger one, barely a year on the job. Her name was Hannah Lindgren, and she took one look at the scene. A pregnant woman bent over a hood in handcuffs, a cleared license plate still glowing on the cruiser laptop, and something in the pit of her stomach turned over. She would remember that exact feeling months later, sitting in a small room with her hand raised, under oath. For 11 minutes, Imani Whitfield sat handcuffed on the curb in front of the house she owned, in the rising heat, in what might have been the start of labor, and she said almost nothing. She answered direct questions. She volunteered not one word beyond them, and then when Doyle asked her, almost mocking now, whether there was anybody she wanted to call, she gave him a name and a number, and she watched the first hairline crack appear in all that certainty. The number she gave reached the front desk of a federal field office downtown. The name she gave was her supervisor's. Within 40 minutes, 2 vehicles turned on to Saddlebrook Lane that looked like nothing the Ashford Glen Police Department was used to seeing on a Tuesday. The first carried Denise Holloway. The section chief of the unit Imani had served in for 10 years. The second carried 2 agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, from the Civil Rights Squad, led by a soft-spoken man named Raymond Tate. Holloway walked straight to the curb. She looked at her colleague sitting cuffed on the concrete in a linen maternity dress, 8 months pregnant, in front of her own home. And she went very, very quiet. Then she turned to Sergeant Dale Pruitt, who had arrived by then to supervise, and she asked him a single question. She asked him if he understood who he had sitting in handcuffs. Pruitt, who had spent the whole drive over assuming this was just a routine headache, did not. For a few long seconds, nobody on the street said anything at all. The neighbors who had drifted out onto their lawns looked at the 2 unmarked vehicles. The federal jackets, the pregnant woman still on the curb, and they felt the gravity of the thing without yet knowing its shape. Doyle stood off to the side with his thumbs hooked into his vest, still wearing the expression of a man who believed he was about to be thanked. He would keep some version of that expression on his face for a very long time. The reveal did not arrive all at once, and that was the whole point of it. First, the credentials, finally produced, identifying Imani Whitfield as a senior trial attorney with the United States Department of Justice. Then the phone call, confirmed by Denise Holloway in person, standing right there in the driveway. Then the slow sinking understanding, spreading through the gathered officers like cold water, poured down the back of a collar, of what her section actually did for a living. Imani announced none of it herself. Other people said it for her. And that is the only way that kind of truth ever lands clean. Then came the detail that turned a very bad morning into an outright catastrophe for the Ashford Glen Police Department. While Agent Tate reviewed the body camera footage right there on the scene, Holloway made a quiet phone call of her own, and what she learned she did not say out loud, though Imani had already half guessed it. The section had, 4 months earlier, opened a preliminary review of the Ashford Glen Police Department. The complaints had been trickling in for years. The patterns had been forming, quietly, on paper, in a folder in an office hundreds of miles away. The department was already, without knowing it, under a federal lens. Garrett Doyle had just put handcuffs on a federal civil rights attorney in the middle of the very investigation he had no idea was happening. And here, even cuffed on the curb of her own house, Imani did the careful thing, the thing that tells you everything about who she was. She would touch none of it. A lawyer cannot investigate a case in which she herself is the victim, and she said so plainly. From the curb, before anyone even had to ask. She would step away entirely from anything involving Ashford Glen. Other people would handle it. The system would handle it. That line, the line between wanting the truth and wanting revenge, was the whole of who she was. And it was the one thing about her that Garrett Doyle would never ever understand. The paramedics came at last. Imani was uncuffed and taken to the hospital, where the contractions turned out to be early, frightening, but not yet the real thing. The baby was fine, she would carry to term, but the morning had left a different kind of mark on her, the kind that does not show on a monitor, and it would not be hers alone to carry. In the weeks that followed, the investigation widened, and the witnesses began to come forward one by one. Lorraine Bishop, the retired librarian, handed over 4 minutes of clear, steady video, and she never once apologized for filming it. A man named Reginald Banks learned that his own buried complaint suddenly had company. 2 years before, Banks, who ran a small business called Banks Family Catering, had been pulled over leaving that same neighborhood after dropping off an order for a country club luncheon. He had been accused of casing houses. He had been held on the shoulder of the road for an hour, while his trays of food went cold in the back of his van and his teenage helper sat beside him, terrified. The officer who stopped him carried badge number 3127. Banks had filed a complaint. It had vanished. Now, sitting across a table from a federal investigator, he found out he had not been imagining the pattern for 2 years. He found out he had been right, and he agreed to tell the whole story. Then there was Hannah Lindgren, the rookie who had felt her stomach turn at the curb. She made a choice that cost her real things, friendships inside her own department, the easy trust of people she rode with every day. She told the investigators exactly what she had seen, including the detail that mattered most, the cleared license plate that Doyle had looked at and chosen to ignore. It is one thing to do the right thing when it is free. It is another to do it when the bill comes due. Lindgren paid the bill. There was one more witness the department had never thought to worry about. The paramedic who had knelt beside Imani at the curb. A 15-year veteran named Curtis Vaughn had done what good paramedics do under pressure. He had documented everything, her vital signs, the marks the cuffs had left on her wrists, the time she had first told an officer she needed help, and the time anyone actually listened. His run sheet, written in the flat, unexcitable language of emergency medicine, became one of the quietest and most damaging documents in the entire case. Now here is where a great many stories about this kind of thing simply end, with anger and a video and nothing else. This one did not end there, and the reason it did not is worth sitting with. The department's first instinct was the old, reliable one. The union representative arrived within the hour and started shaping a story. A supervisor floated the idea that the body camera must have malfunctioned, right up until somebody pointed out that 3 other cameras had not. Doyle himself never wavered, not for a second. In his first interview, in his second, in every statement he ever gave, he repeated the same handful of words. He had read the situation. He had followed his training. He had done nothing wrong. He said it the way a man says a prayer, as if enough repetition could turn it into the truth. It could not, because for once the evidence could not be made to disappear. The Internal Affairs Review, dragged into the daylight by the footage and the federal interest, sustained multiple findings against him. And then the case moved somewhere the department could not control at all. This is the part the public usually gets wrong. After years of hearing one phrase shouted back and forth without anyone explaining it, there is a federal law, often summarized as the deprivation of rights under color of law. That makes it a crime for an officer to willfully violate someone's constitutional rights using the power of the badge. Garrett Doyle was charged under it, and the shield he and his union were counting on, the thing called qualified immunity, does not stop a charge like that. Qualified immunity protects an officer from being sued for money damages unless he violated a clearly established right. It is a powerful protection in a civil courtroom where people seek a check, but it does nothing whatsoever to stop a criminal prosecution. The badge that had made Garrett Doyle feel untouchable for 16 years had never actually made him immune to this. He had simply never been held to account before, and he had mistaken that long run of luck for a law of nature. He was convicted. He lost his job. He lost his pension. He lost his state certification, which meant he would never again lawfully wear a badge anywhere in the country. And in time, he lost his freedom. Through every step of it, he insisted he was the real victim. A small, loyal circle believed him. The footage kept saying otherwise. At his sentencing, he was offered the chance to say something, anything, that resembled reflection. He used it instead to talk about his years of service and his instincts and the dangers of the job. He did not mention the woman on the curb. He did not mention the contractions, or the cleared plate, or the lie he had spoken into a radio at 9:58 in the morning. To the very end, Garrett Doyle believed the system had failed him. In truth, the system had, for once, simply worked. But the part of all this that mattered most to Imani came later and quieter. The Department of Justice finished its broader investigation of the Ashford Glen Police Department, the one she never touched. It found a pattern, written across years of buried complaints, ignored plate readers, and traffic stops that began with a decision about who belonged. The department entered into something called a consent decree, a binding, court-supervised agreement to reform itself, overseen by an independent monitor whose job was to make sure the promises turned into practice. A civilian oversight board was created, made up of residents instead of insiders. An early warning system was put in place to flag officers, like Doyle, whose complaints stacked up year after year while nothing happened. And a settlement of $4.7 million funded a community legal clinic, the Ashford Glen Community Justice Clinic, a place where people who could never afford a lawyer could learn what their rights actually were before they ever found themselves bent over the hood of a car. The Independent Monitor's first public report came out a year later, and it did not soften anything. It found that the department had, for more than a decade, treated certain residents as visitors in their own city, and that the failure had never really been about a few bad officers. It had been about a culture, one that quietly rewarded men like Garrett Doyle and quietly punished officers like Hannah Lindgren for telling the truth. Reading it, Imani felt no rush of triumph. She felt the particular, bone-deep tiredness of someone who has just been proven right about something she would have given anything to be wrong about. None of it undid the 11 minutes. Imani never once pretended that it could. But it meant that the next pregnant woman who drove through those gates would be driving into a different department than the one Garrett Doyle had spent 16 years building his certainty inside. And that, she decided, was worth something. That was worth a great deal. Imani Whitfield delivered a healthy baby girl that autumn. She went back to work, to the same patient questions and the same footage studied frame by frame, because the work had not changed and neither had she. She never gave a single interview about her own case. When colleagues raised it, she tended to change the subject. Not out of fear, but because she had already said everything she needed to say. She had said it at the curb. She had said it on 4 cameras. She had said it in a voice she never once raised. People kept calling her brave. She did not think brave was quite the right word for it. She had simply known something most people in that driveway did not. The truth, kept calm and put on the record, is heavier than any badge a man can pin to his chest. The officer who had been so certain that morning had wanted her to be afraid. He had wanted her to beg, to make the kind of loud, ugly scene that lets a man go home and tell himself a comforting story afterward. She had refused him even that small thing, and in the refusing, she had handed the system the one thing it needed to finally do its job. She kept the deed to the house framed and hung in the front hallway, not as a trophy. She did not need trophies. She hung it there as a fact, a plain and stubborn fact, the first thing her daughter would learn to read. This is ours. We belong here. No one gets to decide otherwise. Before you go, a few honest words. This story is a work of fiction. The people, the police department, the company, the city neighborhood, and the events in it were all created for this telling. And any resemblance to real people, living or dead, or to real events is entirely coincidental. The legal ideas inside it, though, are real and worth carrying with you. A lawful stop requires a real specific reason, never a hunch and never the color of someone's skin. Recording the police in public is a protected right. Qualified immunity can shield an officer from a lawsuit, but it does not shield him from criminal charges for willfully violating your rights. And a federal pattern investigation ending in a consent decree is one of the real ways a broken department is forced to change. Here is the part of this that stays with me, the part I keep turning over. Imani never raised her voice. We tend to picture justice as something loud, a shout, a confrontation, a perfect comeback at exactly the right moment. But the strongest thing she did was stay calm and let the truth be recorded exactly as it happened. Dignity is not weakness. Sometimes it is the most powerful move left on the board. And very often the quietest person in the room is the one the record ends up believing. If this story moved you, sit with that for a moment, and then go be that calm, that steady, and that kind for someone who needs it.